Hello, psychology. This is the beginning of therapy notes. Actually, technically, we've already taken some notes. So this unit is for modules 70 to 73. The notes that we've already taken was on that therapy comparisons chart, but this is kind of clarifying a few things within there and talking about some of the effectiveness of different types of therapy. So this is going to be focusing more on module 72 than anything else, but I'll hit on some of the other things from some of the other modules. So first off, just to kind of clarify, we've been talking about some different types of therapy on our therapies chart, and we've been mostly talking about what we call psychotherapy. And psychotherapy is when you have a trained therapist using some sort of psychological technique to help somebody overcome a psychological problem. In other words, psychotherapies are basically talk therapies. And so talk therapies, you have some sort of psychologist or psychiatrist that is talking you through this problem. They're working using some sort of technique. So we've talked about in our therapies chart, we've talked about psychoanalysis, we've talked about humanistic approach, behavioralism, we've talked about cognitivism and group therapies. All of those are psychotherapies. Now, for the most part, what you will find is that if you go and talk to a therapist today and you go talk to a psychiatrist or psychologist, they will tell you that they don't really use any one specific type of therapy. They kind of use a combination of a lot of them. So most therapists use this kind of eclectic approach. And so they grab from a little bit of this and a little from that from many different types to kind of form their own style. And it's ever evolving. And so there's always new therapies and new types that are always added. Matter of fact, this video I'll actually talk about a couple of them that are newer therapies that psychiatrists and psychologists have continuing education, that they bone up on these skills and they learn about some of these things. For example, my sister-in-law had been a practicing psychologist for a number of years, and I showed her some of the stuff that was in our book that they talked about, and she's like, well, I do use client-centered therapy where I'm focusing on the client, and obviously I practice active listening, but I also practice some of these behavior therapies as well, or some of the cognitive therapies. And so it's not one or the other. Oftentimes psychologists are kind of picking and choosing the things that they like. So I do have kind of some picture representations of some of the types of therapies that we've already talked about. So I thought I'd share those with you, and they kind of take up the room. So I'm going to make those go away. So this one is when people are always saying that I can't do this, and the therapist, the psychologist, gets you to say no, you can. You have to say I can. So what type of therapy is this, where you're changing this person's thinking? So they're going to say, instead of I can't, they're saying I can. Cognitive therapy. What about this one, where it's got the guy that's, barely in the door and there's some spiders and jars over here, and he says, a large spider 5 meters away doesn't seem all that scary anymore. And there's this giant spider behind him. So bringing him in to slowly get introduced to small spiders, and obviously eventually bringing this big spider. So what type of therapy is that? Behavior therapy, so like systematic desensitization, slowly getting him used to the little ones and working him up to apparently a very giant spider, which, to be honest, I think would scare anybody. What about this one, where it's Humpty Dumpty? Humpty Dumpty is sitting on the couch, and it says, the psychiatrist is saying, eventually I'd like you to be able to put yourself back together. So the client is solving his or her own problems. Sounds like humanism to me, client-centered therapy. What about this one, where the doctor is offering the guy who is supposedly a smoker, and he's offering him a cigarette and says smoke, and obviously it's on a mousetrap. So another behavior therapy, aversion therapy. So if you're always reaching for a cigarette and you get pinched by a mousetrap every time, maybe you'll start to link that with every time you reach for a cigarette, your hand will hurt. I don't know, silly as it sounds. What about this one? It says, I didn't mean that. Oh, but the little guy inside your head says, but I did. Ooh, your inner voice, your inner feelings are actually saying, I did mean what I said, even though you're actually saying out loud that I didn't mean that. What does that sound like? Inner voice, psychoanalysis, anyone? What about this one, where we're looking at what you think and how you feel affects what you do, and it becomes a cycle. So how what you think affects what you do, which affects how you feel, and it goes in this roundabout cycle. So how you think affects your what you do and your behaviors, and so it affects how you feel. Cognitive behavioralism, so CBT therapy. And what about this one where it says it's got death on the couch, the Grim Reaper here, and he's talking to his therapist, and it says, it feels like people are always trying to avoid me. So the theme in all of his relationships, everybody's running away. Theme, relationships, psychodynamic therapy. There's a thought. All right. So there are some new therapies that you need to be aware of. So a couple of new therapies. First of all, you have what we call EMDR. EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, believe it or not. And I have this picture up here that is generally what it looks like. But basically, here's our therapist, okay? And here is our client. And so this is oftentimes when the client has had some sort of trauma. And what will happen is, and it sounds really weird and silly, but what happens is that the therapist is holding up her finger here, and she basically moves her finger back and forth, and the client is supposed to track the finger, kind of like a metronome, going back and forth and just following her finger. It's not supposed to hypnotize you, okay? But it is supposed to go and kind of get you sidetracked on following the finger so much that you're not really paying attention to the words that you're talking about. It's kind of supposed to lull you, kind of not into hypnotism, but it kind of lull you into almost where you're relaxed, okay? There's different suggestions on why it works for trauma victims. They talk about that it distracts people. They talk about that it relaxes people. There's talk about, that whole eye movement thing is, you're not concentrating on what you're actually saying. And it sounds weird, but I'll be honest, I've actually talked to people that have used EMDR, and they said that it was very successful for them. They said it was really weird in the beginning, and it was very stressful in the beginning because they are actually asking you to talk about your trauma. And for some people, I know somebody that particularly started with EMDR, and she couldn't continue because it was just really, really intense. And I don't think it had anything to do with EMDR itself, just having to talk about her trauma. So it is successful for some people. Other therapy, light exposure therapy. This is interesting because there is something called seasonal depression, where people actually get depressed more often in the winter months, simply because they don't have as much exposure to the sun. And so as a result, they get depressed just because of the season. And so, believe it or not, therapy actually recommends going and exposing yourself to more light. And so sometimes that may even include like tanning beds, believe it or not. But what obviously because of the cancer risk and things like that, we're not advocating that. But having a special light that they stay under for a length of time helps. This one says it's for my depression. Get your own. He's got it attached to him. That's not how it actually works. You go sit under a light like in a chair. Okay. People think that maybe it works because it resets that circadian rhythm, and so in the winter you don't have as many light hours, and so maybe your body gets confused as to when it's daytime and nighttime, and you don't get enough sleep, so that causes depression. Not real sure why it works, but it does work for seasonal depression. So hey. Those are some other types of therapies that are out there. All right, I'm going to end right here, and the next video we'll talk about how effective different types of therapies are. Let me know if you have any questions.